That day, I was ready to say yes to the love of my life, until he humiliated me in front of everyone. But what he didn't know was that I had a secret that would change everything, and by the time he found out, it was already too late. The morning sun poured through the narrow window of the modest apartment, casting a soft glow on the wooden floor. Helena stood in front of the mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she twisted her dark hair into a bun. Her reflection stared back at her, the simple white dress draping over her figure like a whisper of hope. She smiled faintly, but her heart raced. Today, she would marry Eduardo, the man she loved. From the corner of the room, her grandmother watched with eyes full of warmth and pride. The old woman's hands rested on the arms of the chair, her fragile frame barely concealed by the thick knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. Helena glanced at her and turned, kneeling gently by her side. "You look beautiful," the grandmother said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Helena's face. "Like your mother on her wedding day." Helena's heart ached at the mention of her parents. They had passed away years ago, leaving only her grandmother as family. She placed her hand over the old woman's, feeling the warmth beneath her palm. "I wish they were here," she whispered. "I wish they could see me now." "They would be proud," her grandmother replied, but there was a hesitation in her voice, a weight that lingered just behind her words. "But are you sure about this, Helena? Eduardo's family?" Helena lowered her eyes, brushing the fabric of her dress. "They don't like me," she admitted, "but Eduardo does. He chose me." Her grandmother sighed, squeezing her hand gently. "Love is not always enough, my daughter. You have a good heart, but his family, they care for status and power. I see the way his mother looks at you." Helena smiled, though her heart twisted uncomfortably. "She'll see how much I love him. One day she'll accept me." The old woman said nothing more, only kissed Helena's forehead tenderly. The small church in the town square was already filling with guests when Helena arrived, her hands gripping the bouquet tightly. The lace veil cascaded down her back, brushing against the worn stone steps as she walked inside. Her heart pounded louder with each step toward the altar where Eduardo waited. He stood tall, handsome in his dark suit, but his eyes flickered nervously to the side where his mother sat. Dona Margarita's gaze was sharp, unforgiving. Her lips barely moved, but Helena could feel the weight of her silent judgment from across the room. Helena's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she pushed forward, focusing on Eduardo. His hand reached out to hers as she approached, and for a fleeting second, the world around them faded. The priest began to speak, his voice calm and steady. Helena barely heard the words, her eyes locked on Eduardo's. She had dreamed of this moment since the day they met. But as the ceremony progressed, Eduardo's hand grew cold in hers. His grip loosened. A murmur rippled through the crowd when he finally let go. "Hello guys. If you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us. I can't," Eduardo said suddenly, his voice trembling. Helena's breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered, searching his face for some explanation. Eduardo stepped back, his eyes shifting to his mother, who now watched with satisfaction. "I can't marry her," he repeated, louder this time, his voice echoing through the church. "She's not right for me." The room fell into stunned silence. Helena felt the stares of every guest burning into her. Her grandmother's frail figure stood near the front pew, tears welling in her eyes. Eduardo's words sliced through Helena's chest like a blade, leaving her breathless and trembling. She turned, barely able to hold back the tears threatening to fall. Without another word, she fled from the church, the sound of whispers following her into the street. The veil tore as she ran, fluttering behind her like the ghost of a life that would never be. Helena didn't stop until she reached the edge of town. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed against the steps of her grandmother's house, sobbing into her hands. In the days that followed, Helena shut herself away from the world. The humiliation lingered, the echoes of laughter and pity haunting her every waking moment. Eduardo didn't come, not once. Her grandmother sat by her side, offering gentle words and warm tea, but nothing could soothe the ache in her heart. Then, one evening, a letter arrived. The elegant handwriting bore the mark of a lawyer. Helena unfolded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the words with disbelief. Her grandmother, who had passed quietly in her sleep only days before, had left everything to her, an inheritance that stretched far beyond the small apartment they had shared. Properties, businesses, wealth she had never imagined possible now belonged to her. Helena's fingers trembled around the edges of the letter. For the first time since the wedding, she smiled. The days following the failed wedding passed in a blur of silence and shadows. Helena barely left the house, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her like an anchor. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eduardo standing at the altar, his eyes shifting toward his mother before he spoke those unforgivable words. The town whispered. Neighbors stared from their windows as she passed by. Pity and curiosity etched across their faces. She could feel their judgment, the silent questions that hung in the air. Why had Eduardo rejected her? What had she done to deserve such disgrace? Helena avoided the market, the church, and even the small garden her grandmother had once loved to tend. She couldn't bear the stares or the murmurs. Instead, she lingered by the old window of her apartment, watching the world move on without her. But then the letter came. It arrived unexpectedly, a crisp envelope delivered by hand. The lawyer's name, embossed in gold at the top, hinted at something significant. At first, Helena thought it was a mistake, a legal issue involving her grandmother's funeral arrangements. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity won over despair. The letter revealed a truth Helena had never imagined. Her grandmother, quiet and humble, had concealed a vast fortune. Properties, businesses, investments, assets Helena had never known existed were now hers. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Her grandmother had always lived modestly, never hinting at the wealth she possessed. Helena could barely comprehend it. But as the weight of the inheritance settled in, so did something else. A flicker of something cold and sharp stirred in her chest. Anger. Eduardo had humiliated her. His family had treated her like dirt beneath their feet. Now, with more power and wealth than she could have ever dreamed, Helena realized she had a choice. She could disappear, live quietly in comfort, or she could return. And she would return. The transformation began in secret. Helena spent weeks in the city, far from the prying eyes of the small town that had witnessed her disgrace. She met with lawyers, financial advisors, and architects, slowly taking control of the vast empire her grandmother had left behind. Her first move was subtle. A property on the edge of town, once owned by Eduardo's father, was quietly purchased through intermediaries. The family never suspected the buyer was Helena. Then came the shares. Small investments in Eduardo's business ventures, each accumulating quietly until Helena held more power than anyone realized. She cut her hair. The long locks that once hung in soft curls were replaced by sleek waves that framed her face with a sharp elegance. Expensive dresses replaced the modest clothes she had worn for years. Pearls no longer adorned her neck. Now it was diamonds and silk. Helena was no longer the shy girl from the modest apartment by the market. She became something else. The first time Eduardo saw her again was at a charity event in the city. Helena hadn't planned to attend, but curiosity got the better of her. She arrived late, slipping through the grand hall with quiet confidence, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Eduardo was there, laughing with colleagues, his arm draped around the waist of Carolina, the woman his mother had chosen for him. Helena watched from the corner of the room, unnoticed at first. But as she stepped forward, Eduardo's eyes met hers. His laughter faded, his expression shifting into something between shock and disbelief. Helena smiled faintly, lifting her glass in silent acknowledgement. Eduardo excused himself from the conversation, making his way toward her. I didn't know you were back in the city," he said, his voice hesitant. "I never left," Helena replied smoothly, swirling the wine in her glass. Eduardo's eyes flickered with unease. He glanced at her expensive dress, the diamond bracelet that glinted under the chandelier's light. "You look Different, he said, struggling to find the words. I suppose I am, Helena replied, her gaze steady. Time changes people, doesn't it? Eduardo opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, Carolina appeared at his side. Her sharp blue eyes lingered on Helena with a flicker of recognition and disdain. Oh, Carolina said with a forced smile. I didn't realize Eduardo's ex-fiancé had made a habit of attending these events. Helena's smile didn't waver. I like to stay involved, she said softly, especially when my investments are concerned. Eduardo stiffened beside Carolina, confusion crossing his face. Investments, he echoed. Helena placed her empty glass on the silver tray of a passing waiter. She leaned in slightly, her voice low enough for only Eduardo to hear. You'd be surprised how much of your world belongs to me now. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Eduardo standing motionless in the center of the grand hall, his fiancée tugging at his arm. The months that followed were marked by small, calculated strikes. A client Eduardo's company depended on suddenly withdrew their contract. Helena had made a better offer. A project his firm was developing faced unexpected legal complications. Helena's lawyers had found the loopholes. Piece by piece, Eduardo's carefully constructed life began to crumble. But it wasn't just him. Dona Margarita's social standing eroded as whispers circulated that her influence was waning. The invitations stopped coming. The high society luncheons where she once sat at the head of the table were now hosted by others, women who were far more eager to welcome Helena into their circle. Helena never gloated. She never openly confronted Eduardo or his mother. Her revenge was quiet, precise. The final blow came unexpectedly. A grand wedding was planned, Eduardo and Carolina's. The entire town was buzzing with excitement, eager to attend what promised to be the most extravagant event of the year. Helena had no intention of going. But then the priest, Father Miguel, sent her a letter. The church needed donations. A new roof, repairs to the stained glass windows. Helena's grandmother had always cared for the small parish. On the day of the wedding, as guests filled the church, Helena arrived not as a guest, but as the benefactor. She stepped inside, her name echoing through the church as Father Miguel publicly thanked her for the generous contribution that saved the parish from closure. Eduardo's face paled as he watched from the altar. Carolina's smile faltered. Helena met their gaze, offering nothing more than a polite nod. She wasn't there to stop the wedding. Her revenge was already complete. The grand hall buzzed with laughter and conversation, but Eduardo barely heard any of it. His eyes drifted across the room, searching for her. Helena had not only returned, she had returned transformed. When she left him standing at the charity gala weeks ago, her parting words echoed in his mind for days. You'd be surprised how much of your world belongs to me now. At first, he thought it was a bitter exaggeration. But as the weeks passed, the truth began to reveal itself in small, calculated ways. The client he had been negotiating with for months suddenly canceled their deal. A promising development project hit legal snags, and his investors were growing restless. Every time Eduardo tried to contain the damage, it was as if someone had anticipated his every move. It was her. Helena never appeared directly involved, but Eduardo began noticing her name connected to powerful figures within the industry. Rumors spread that she had become a silent force behind the largest corporate investments in the city. His mother, Dona Margarita, dismissed it as coincidence. She's nothing but a petty girl trying to play grown-up. Margarita scoffed over dinner one evening. Let her enjoy whatever small inheritance she has. It won't last long, but Eduardo wasn't so sure. And tonight, as the ballroom glittered with chandeliers and the city's most influential gathered, Eduardo saw her again. Helena stood by the balcony, holding a glass of champagne, as if she belonged there. And perhaps she did now. Her dark hair cascaded in loose waves over her shoulder, and the sleek black dress she wore hugged her frame with an elegance that left no room for doubt. She was no longer the woman he had left at the altar. Eduardo's fiancée, Carolina, noticed his lingering stare and slipped her arm around his waist, pulling him closer. Helena again? Carolina's voice carried that sharp edge she always used when discussing her. She's everywhere these days. Eduardo's gaze didn't shift. She has every right to be here, he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Carolina narrowed her eyes, the corners of her mouth twitching in annoyance. She's doing this on purpose. You know that, right? Eduardo finally looked at her. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Carolina said slowly, that she isn't as innocent as she wants everyone to believe. Women like Helena hold grudges. She's using whatever she inherited to try and humiliate you. Eduardo frowned, but deep down he wondered if Carolina was right. Across the room, Helena caught Eduardo's eye. She didn't look away. Instead, she smiled softly and lifted her glass in a quiet toast. Eduardo's stomach tightened. This was no coincidence. The next morning, Eduardo arrived at his office to find his assistant pale and anxious. There's a problem, she said as soon as he walked in. Eduardo didn't even have time to sit before she placed a folder on his desk. I received notice this morning. The investors in the coastal development project are pulling out. Eduardo stiffened. What? Why? She hesitated, lowering her voice. Helena. She made a counteroffer. Better terms. They accepted. Eduardo's hands curled into fists. He pushed back his chair abruptly and stood, pacing toward the window that overlooked the city. The weight of the situation bore down on him. This wasn't random. Helena was deliberately dismantling everything he had worked for. For the first time, Eduardo understood something clearly. She wasn't trying to humiliate him. She was trying to destroy him, and she was succeeding. Later that evening, Eduardo sat in his mother's living room, sipping whiskey as she spoke about the upcoming wedding preparations. Carolina sat beside him, flipping through invitations and floral arrangements. But Eduardo wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere. May, Eduardo interrupted suddenly. Did you know about Helena's inheritance? Dona Margarita's eyes flickered briefly before narrowing. I heard rumors. Nothing more. Eduardo leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. She's not the same person. She's buying out our projects, undercutting our deals. It's deliberate. Dona Margarita waved a hand dismissively. She's playing games, Eduardo. Let her. She'll lose interest eventually. That girl doesn't have the stomach for real business. But Eduardo wasn't convinced. She's already hurt us. If this keeps up, we could lose everything. His mother's lips tightened. You worry too much. Eduardo stood, unable to sit still. I need to speak to her. Carolina's eyes snapped toward him. What? I need to talk to Helena. Face to face. Carolina rose from her seat, her voice rising with her. Absolutely not. Eduardo met her gaze calmly. This isn't personal, Carolina. It's business. Carolina laughed bitterly. Oh, it's personal. You're chasing after your ex-fiancé weeks before our wedding. If that's not personal, I don't know what is. Eduardo's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Deep down, he knew she was right, but that didn't stop him. When Eduardo arrived at Helena's office the next afternoon, the receptionist gave him a polite but skeptical glance. I don't have an appointment, he admitted. But could you let her know Eduardo is here? The receptionist nodded and made the call. Minutes later, Helena appeared, her expression unreadable as she met Eduardo's gaze. She led him into her office, closing the door softly behind them. I'm surprised to see you, Helena said, taking a seat behind her desk. To what do I owe the pleasure? Eduardo hesitated, unsure how to begin. You know why I'm here, he finally said. Helena tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Do I? She replied. Eduardo stepped closer, his voice lowering. You've been buying out my investors, undercutting my deals. It's not coincidence. You're doing this on purpose. Helena's gaze didn't waver. I'm simply making good business decisions, she said calmly. It's not my fault if your investors find my terms more appealing. Eduardo's eyes narrowed. This isn't business, Helena. It's revenge. Helena's expression softened, but not with sympathy. If I wanted revenge, Eduardo, she said quietly, I wouldn't stop at your business. I'd destroy everything. For a moment, Silence filled the room. Eduardo felt the weight of her words, the cold finality behind them. And for the first time, he realized he might have made a mistake far greater than leaving her at the altar. Eduardo lingered in Helena's office, his gaze locked on hers. The calmness in her voice, the steady way she met his eyes. It unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. This wasn't the Helena he remembered. She had always been soft, forgiving. The woman sitting in front of him now was a different force entirely. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "I didn't come here to argue," Eduardo said, his tone softer. "I just need to understand. Why? Why go to such lengths? Is this really about what happened at the altar?" Helena leaned back in her chair, her fingers interlocking as she studied him. For a moment, Eduardo thought she might laugh. But instead, she sighed, as if the question itself bored her. "You humiliated me in front of everyone I knew," Helena said finally, her voice even. "You stood there, in front of God and our families, and told the world I wasn't good enough for you." Eduardo flinched. "I know I hurt you," he admitted, his eyes dropping to the edge of her desk. "But No," Helena interrupted, her voice sharp. "You don't know. You walked away that day and left me to pick up the pieces. I had to stand there, Eduardo, with everyone staring at me like I was nothing, like I didn't deserve to be loved. And you laughed with your mother as if I never mattered." Eduardo's throat tightened. He remembered that day vividly, the way his mother's hand gripped his shoulder, the whispered words of doubt she fed him right up to the moment he said the vows. He had convinced himself he was doing the right thing, that Helena wasn't ready for the life his family demanded. But standing there now, with the weight of her stare bearing down on him, Eduardo couldn't shake the shame curling in his chest. "I regret what I did," he said quietly. Helena's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Regret doesn't erase the past," she replied. "And it doesn't change what's happening now. Your company, your family's reputation. It's all crumbling, Eduardo. And I didn't even have to try that hard." Eduardo stiffened at the casual cruelty in her words. "This isn't you," he said, shaking his head. "You're not like this." Helena's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something softer, an echo of the woman he once loved. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Maybe I wasn't," she said simply. "But people change." Eduardo shifted, frustration bubbling beneath his calm facade. "You're proving my mother right," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "She always said you'd never fit in, that you weren't like us." A flash of something dangerous crossed Helena's face, but she didn't raise her voice. "Your mother feared me because I threatened the illusion she built around you," Helena replied smoothly. "She knew you loved me, and she hated that someone like me, a woman with nothing, could hold power over you. But the funny thing is, Eduardo, now I really do have power. And there's nothing she can do to stop me." Eduardo clenched his jaw. "What do you want, Helena? Money? Apology?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't need your money," she said. "And your apology means nothing to me. This isn't about revenge, Eduardo. Not in the way you think." "Then what is it about?" he asked, stepping closer to her desk. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're enjoying tearing my life apart." Helena rose from her chair slowly, the confidence in her movements unwavering. She stepped around the desk, stopping just inches from him. "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything," she said, her voice low but steady. "Not just your business, not just your money. I want you to feel the loneliness, the humiliation, the doubt that I felt. I want you to wake up one morning and realize you don't know who you are anymore." Eduardo's heart pounded. "And when that day comes," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helena's gaze didn't falter. "You'll know how it feels to be me," she said. A long silence stretched between them. Eduardo could feel his pulse in his ears, the weight of her words lingering long after they were spoken. Finally, he stepped back. "You've made your point," he said quietly. Helena watched him, but she didn't respond. Eduardo hesitated at the door, glancing back at her one last time. Part of him wanted to plead, to ask for a second chance. But the woman standing in front of him wasn't the same Helena he once knew. He left without another word. Days turned into weeks, and Eduardo's world continued to unravel. Carolina began to question the stability of their relationship as the cracks in Eduardo's business deepened. Investors pulled out of new projects, and rumors spread that Eduardo's company was on the verge of collapse. One evening, Eduardo found himself pacing in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the large window. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen, Carolina's name flashing brightly. He ignored it. Instead, he sank into his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. A knock at the door startled him. "Come in," Eduardo called, expecting his assistant. But when the door opened, it wasn't his assistant at all. Helena stepped inside, uninvited, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Eduardo straightened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tight. Helena closed the door behind her, crossing the room with deliberate grace. "I thought I'd check in," she said, stopping just short of his desk. "You've been quiet lately." Eduardo frowned, trying to read the expression behind her calm exterior. "You didn't come here to check in," he replied. Helena's lips curved into a faint smile. "No," she admitted. "I came here to see how much longer you'll last." Eduardo stiffened. "This game you're playing, it's not a game," Helena interrupted. "I'm simply doing what needs to be done." He rose from his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Do you hate me that much?" Helena met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "I don't hate you, Eduardo. But I don't forgive you either." For the first time, Eduardo realized the truth. Helena didn't want his love. She didn't want his regret. She wanted him to fall, and she wouldn't stop until he did. The church bells echoed through the quiet streets, their solemn chime rolling over the rooftops like distant thunder. Eduardo adjusted his tie, standing rigidly at the front of the grand church, flanked by his groomsmen. The ceremony was about to begin, and the guests whispered excitedly behind him. Carolina was late. He tried not to fidget, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. The weight of the past few months sat heavily on his shoulders. No matter how hard he tried to focus on the present, Helena's shadow lurked at the edges of his thoughts. Helena. It had been weeks since their last conversation, but her presence lingered like a scar that wouldn't heal. His business was in free fall, investors were scattering, and his mother, once so proud and unshakable, was beginning to crumble under the pressure. Yet here he stood, about to marry Carolina, the woman his family had deemed suitable. The heavy church doors creaked open, drawing Eduardo's attention. For a brief, gut-wrenching moment, he thought it was Helena. But it wasn't. It was just Carolina, dressed in lace and silk, her veil cascading down her back as she walked down the aisle with slow, deliberate steps. Eduardo's chest tightened. As Carolina approached, Eduardo forced himself to smile. But even as she took his hand, he couldn't shake the lingering unease that settled over him like a storm cloud. The ceremony began. The priest's words washed over Eduardo like white noise, his mind drifting elsewhere. He barely registered Carolina's vows, barely heard his own. It wasn't until the priest asked the fateful question, "If anyone here has reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace," that Eduardo felt the air shift. The church doors creaked open again. Every head turned. Helena stepped inside, her figure framed by the sunlight pouring through the entrance. She wore a sleek black dress, simple yet striking, and her hair was swept into an elegant twist. She wasn't there to cause a scene. She didn't need to. The moment she entered, the atmosphere changed. Eduardo's heart stopped. Helena's gaze met his across the church, calm and unwavering. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Eduardo felt the weight of her presence in his bones. Dona Margarita shifted uncomfortably in the front row, her eyes narrowing as she whispered harshly to one of the guests. Carolina's grip tightened around Eduardo's hand, but he barely noticed. Helena walked down the aisle slowly, each step echoing through the silent church. She stopped near the front, turning to the priest with a soft smile. "I'm not here to object," Helena said, her voice even and calm. I'm here for something else. Eduardo's brow furrowed. The priest nodded hesitantly. Of course, Miss Helena. What can I do for you? Helena handed him a sealed envelope, the golden edges glinting under the chandelier light. I'm making a donation, she said, her eyes flickering toward Eduardo. To the church. In memory of my grandmother. The priest accepted the envelope with a gracious nod. That's very kind of you, Helena. Your grandmother was a pillar of this community. Eduardo's fists clenched at his sides. Helena met his gaze briefly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. I thought it was the perfect day for it, she added, her tone light but cutting. Eduardo could feel the blood draining from his face. She wasn't here to stop the wedding. Her revenge was more subtle. She wanted him to know, wanted everyone to know, that she had risen far above him, that she had power he could no longer touch. Eduardo's mother shifted again, visibly uneasy. Helena, Dona Margarita spoke, her voice laced with irritation. This isn't the time for... Helena raised a hand delicately, silencing her. I won't take much more of your time, Helena said with a polite nod. I just wanted to pay my respects. With that, she turned and walked out of the church, her heels tapping softly against the marble floor. Eduardo watched her leave, feeling as though the ground beneath him was slowly crumbling. Carolina's hand tugged at his arm. Let it go, she whispered, leaning closer. She's trying to ruin today for you. Don't let her. Eduardo didn't answer. His heart wasn't in the ceremony anymore. Hours later, Eduardo found himself standing alone outside the reception hall. Guests milled about, laughing and toasting inside, but Eduardo had slipped away unnoticed. The weight in his chest wouldn't subside. Helena's return had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The soft crunch of gravel behind him drew his attention. He turned, and there she was again, standing under the dim glow of the garden lights. You're persistent, Eduardo said, unable to hide the bitterness in his tone. Helena's lips curved slightly. I didn't think you'd notice I was gone. Eduardo stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. What do you want from me, Helena? Was humiliating me in front of my family not enough? Helena's gaze didn't waver. I didn't humiliate you, Eduardo, she replied smoothly. You did that to yourself. He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. Deep down, he knew she was right. Eduardo exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Is this your revenge? He asked finally, his voice low. To haunt me at every turn? Helena stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. No, she said quietly. My revenge was watching you destroy everything with your own hands. Eduardo's chest tightened. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice almost pleading. I thought I was doing the right thing. Helena's eyes softened for just a moment, but the steel beneath them remained. You let your mother decide what was right for you, she said, her tone colder now. And now you're left with whatever scraps she gives you. Eduardo flinched at the truth of her words. Do you hate me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helena regarded him for a long moment before shaking her head. No, she said. I don't hate you, Eduardo, but I'll never forgive you. Her words lingered in the air between them, final and absolute. Helena stepped away, disappearing into the shadows of the garden as quietly as she had come. Eduardo remained rooted in place, staring after her long after she was gone. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to lose. The wedding reception faded into the background, its distant music and laughter muted by the weight hanging over Eduardo. He lingered by the garden, staring at the spot where Helena had disappeared into the night. Her words echoed in his mind, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. I don't hate you, but I'll never forgive you. The soft hum of voices from inside the reception hall grew louder as guests began to spill out, some laughing, others drunk on celebration. Eduardo barely noticed. His hands tightened at his sides, but the tension couldn't hold back the sinking feeling in his chest. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. There you are. Carolina's figure emerged from the crowd, her long wedding dress trailing behind her as she approached. Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for answers he didn't have. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, looping her arm around his, as if claiming him before the world. Eduardo forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just needed a moment. Carolina's gaze flickered toward the empty path Helena had walked moments ago. Her grip on Eduardo's arm tightened. "She's not worth your time," Carolina whispered, though the jealousy in her tone was unmistakable. Eduardo said nothing. "She can't hurt you anymore," Carolina continued, stepping closer, her lips brushing his ear. "You have me now, and everything she thought she could take? Still ours." Eduardo forced himself to nod, but as Carolina led him back toward the reception, his steps felt heavier. The celebration carried on without incident. Toasts were made, dances performed, and guests bid their farewells. By the time Eduardo and Carolina returned to his family's estate, the weight in his chest had only grown. Weeks passed. Eduardo's life should have returned to normal. The wedding had been grand, and the newspapers splashed headlines of his new marriage to Carolina, painting them as the city's newest power couple. Eduardo smiled for the cameras, posed when necessary, and did everything expected of him. But behind the curated image, things were far from perfect. Helena's quiet dismantling of his empire continued. His company hemorrhaged deals, and whispers of instability followed him into every boardroom. More investors withdrew, and projects stalled indefinitely. Dona Margarita tried to step in, but her influence wasn't what it used to be. She arranged meetings, but behind closed doors, Eduardo could see the hesitation in potential partners' eyes. They knew his foundation was cracking. Eduardo sat alone in his office one evening, the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A half-empty glass of scotch rested on his desk. Files lay scattered, contracts unsigned. A quiet knock broke the silence. His mother stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Her sharp heels clicked against the marble floor, and she sank into the chair across from him, crossing her legs delicately. "You look exhausted," she said, eyes narrowing. Eduardo didn't look up. "I am." Dona Margarita studied him for a moment before leaning forward. "This is Helena's doing," she said coldly. "We can stop her." Eduardo finally met her gaze. "No, May," he replied quietly. "We can't." She stiffened. "What do you mean we can't? She's just a woman with a little money." "She's not the woman you remember," Eduardo interrupted. His voice was firm, but the fatigue beneath it was undeniable. "She's stronger now, smarter, and she's not stopping." Dona Margarita's lips pressed into a thin line. "We should have never let her near this family," she hissed. "I warned you, Eduardo. I told you she was beneath you." Eduardo's fists tightened on the desk. "Maybe she wasn't the one beneath me," he said quietly, his eyes darkening. His mother's eyes flashed with indignation, but for once, she said nothing. A week later, Eduardo stood outside a modest orphanage on the edge of the city. Rumors of Helena's growing philanthropy had reached him, and despite everything, curiosity pulled him there. He watched from afar as Helena stepped out of a car, dressed simply, her hair tied back. She greeted the children warmly, bending to their level, laughing as they ran circles around her. There was no audience, no reporters, just Helena, as she had always been, kind, genuine. Eduardo's heart twisted painfully. Before he could turn away, Helena's gaze lifted. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and for a fleeting moment, the years between them melted away. Helena approached slowly, her steps careful. Eduardo stayed rooted in place, unsure if he should speak or let her pass. "You didn't have to come," Helena said softly, stopping a few feet from him. "I know," Eduardo replied, "but I did." A breeze stirred between them, rustling the trees nearby. "You're different now," he added, his voice quieter. Helena's eyes softened, but her guard remained. "I had to be," she said simply. Eduardo exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I guess I just wanted to see for myself." Helena watched him for a long moment before speaking. "Is it everything you expected?" she asked, her lips curving faintly. Eduardo shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground. "No," he admitted. It's more. Silence hung between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, Eduardo felt something shift within him. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words heavier than he expected. Not for what happened to my company, but for what I did to you. At the altar, Helena's expression didn't change. I know, she replied, her voice softer than before. But apologies can't undo the past. Eduardo met her gaze, nodding slowly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I just needed you to know. Helena smiled faintly, but it wasn't the same soft smile he remembered from years ago. It carried the weight of someone who had rebuilt herself from the ashes. I do know, she said, and I'm at peace with it. Eduardo felt the tension in his chest ease, just slightly. As Helena turned back toward the orphanage, Eduardo watched her go, realizing something profound. She had won, but it wasn't the victory he had feared. Helena had moved on, and for the first time Eduardo understood, so could he. The past no longer defined either of them. Hello guys, if you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us.